Hello students, welcome back again in my class. This is Dr. Gagan here. Today we'll continue the topic pituitary gland. We have already read about the general features and the relationships of the pituitary gland in the last section. Today we'll discuss about the parts or the subdivisions of the pituitary gland. So let's start it without wasting any time. The gland has two main parts. Basically, this pituitary gland has two main parts. The first is adenohypophysis and the second is neurohypophysis, which differ from each other embryologically, morphologically and functionally. Okay, from every point of view they are different. Adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. Basically you have to study this adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. Okay, so what is adenohypophysis? The adenohypophysis again has three parts: the anterior lobe or the pars anterior or the pars distalis or pars glandularis. The anterior lobe, you can see this in the figure 12.11. This is the pars anterior, this bigger portion in front of this cleft. This is the cleft. In front of this cleft, the bigger portion of this pituitary gland is the pars anterior, and it is also called as pars distalis or pars glandularis or anterior lobe, and this is the largest part of the gland. Second is the intermediate lobe or the pars intermedia. What is this? This is in the form of thin strip which is separated from anterior lobe by an interglandular cleft. I will show you in the figure. This is the figure. You can see this. It is written pars intermedia. This is the pars intermedia and this is a cleft. The portion, this is in the form of a thin strip. In comparison to this, the pars anterior is very big. So this is the largest part of the gland, and this pars intermedia, it is in the form of a thin strip. It is situated posterior to this interglandular cleft. This is a cleft, and the portion which is situated posterior to this cleft is called as pars intermedia. So this was the second portion of adenohypophysis. Now the third one is the tuberal lobe or the pars tuberalis. Tuberal lobe or pars tuberalis is an upward extension of the anterior lobe that surrounds and forms the part of the infundibulum. It's an upward extension of anterior lobe. You can see this. It is written pars tuberalis. It is an upward extension of this anterior lobe. The anterior lobe is going upward, so this upward extension of anterior lobe is called as pars tuberalis or tuberal lobe. Okay? So these are the basically three portions of adenohypophysis. Actually, we have divided the pituitary gland in two parts: adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. So adenohypophysis has three lobes: the anterior lobe, the intermediate lobe and the tuberal lobe. The another name for anterior lobe is pars anterior, pars distalis or pars glandularis. The another name for intermediate lobe is pars intermedia, and the another name for the tuberal lobe is the pars tuberalis. Okay. Now next comes the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis again has three parts: the posterior lobe or the neural lobe or the pars posterior. Posterior lobe, neural lobe or pars posterior. You can see this in the figure. Pars posterior. This is the pars posterior, or you can also say posterior lobe or neural lobe. Okay? It is smaller than the anterior lobe and lies in the posterior concavity of larger anterior lobe. If you compare this from pars anterior, so it is a little bit smaller than the pars anterior. Okay, this is smaller than the pars anterior. So pars posterior is smaller than pars anterior, and it lies in the concavity of the larger. This is the concavity of anterior lobe. It lies in the anterior concavity of the posterior concavity of anterior lobe. Now next is the infundibular stem, which contains because it is a neurohypophysis, as the name suggests, it is neurohypophysis as it contains the neural connections. The infundibular stem, which contains the neural connections of the posterior lobe with the hypothalamus. Okay? This is the infundibulum portion. This is the infundibulum. It is written infundibulum. It contains the neural connections. As I have already told you, the hypothalamus is situated above to the pituitary gland. So the neural connections between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland occurs through infundibulum. It contains the neural connections of posterior lobe with the hypothalamus. Next comes the medial eminence. The medial eminence, here it is shown. the median eminence of Tubero which is continuous with infundibular stem. So basically, neurohypophysis, the second portion of the pituitary gland, again has three parts: the posterior lobe or the pars posterior, second is infundibular stem, and the third is median eminence of the Tubero. So these are the two parts of basically pituitary gland, the adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. The adenohypophysis is larger than neurohypophysis. It is made up of three parts: the pars anterior or the anterior lobe or pars distalis. Second is intermediate lobe. This the portion which is situated posterior to this cleft is the pars intermedia or the intermediate lobe, and the third is pars tuberalis or the tuberal lobe. It's an upward extension of pars anterior. Next is the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis contains the neural connections between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. It has three parts: the pars posterior. The pars posterior is also called as posterior lobe. The second is infundibulum, and third one is median eminence. This infundibulum is it contains the neural connections between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay, so these are the parts and the subdivisions of the pituitary gland. Now next comes the arterial supply, the blood supply. The hypophysis cerebri is supplied by the branches of internal carotid artery. Internal carotid artery की branches इसको supply करती हैं. There are basically two arteries on each side, one superior hypophyseal artery on each side and one inferior hypophyseal artery on each side. You have to learn only this: one superior hypophyseal artery on each side and inferior hypophyseal artery on each side. Okay. And there is another important point in this arterial supply. The anterior lobe or the pars distalis is supplied exclusively by portal vessels arising from capillary tufts formed by the superior hypophyseal arteries. There is this superior hypophyseal arteries forms the capillary tufts, and from those capillary tufts arises the portal vessels, and those portal vessels supplies the anterior lobe. Okay, the pars distalis. So this is the important point in this regarding it. The portal vessels are in the form of long portal vessels and short portal vessels. Now next comes the venous drainage. The short veins emerges on the surface of the gland and drains into neighboring dural venous sinuses. छोटी छोटी वेन्स ग्लैंड में से निकलती हैं और आसपास के जो ड्यूरल वीनस साइनसेस हैं उनके अंदर ड्रेन करती हैं, एंड द हार्मोन्स पासेस आउट ऑफ द ग्लैंड थ्रू द वीनस ब्लड एंड कैरी टू देयर टारगेट सेल्स. हार्मोन्स जो निकलते हैं ग्लैंड में से वो वीनस ब्लड के थ्रू ट्रैवल करते हैं और टारगेट सेल्स तक पहुंचाए जाते हैं. सो दिस वाज द आर्टीरियल सप्लाई एंड द वीनस सप्लाई ऑफ द पिट्यूटरी ग्लैंड. तो आपको इसमें बेसिकली याद रखना है the hypophysis cerebri is supplied by the internal branches of internal carotid artery. One is the superior hypophyseal artery on each side, and second is the inferior hypophyseal artery on each side, and the superior hypophyseal artery forms the capillary tufts, and from those capillary tufts arises the portal vessels which supplies exclusively the pars anterior or the pars distalis. And these portal vessels are of two types: long portal vessels and short portal vessels. And in venous drainage, there are short veins which emerges on the surface of the gland and they drain into neighboring venous sinuses, and the hormones which passes out of the gland this pass out of the gland through this venous blood, and then they are carried to their target cells. In the next section we'll talk about the histology and what are the hormones which are secreted by this gland. So till then you just read it properly, the parts and the subdivisions of the pituitary gland and the blood supply of the pituitary gland. In the next section we'll discuss about the histology or the hormonal secretions of this pituitary gland. Till then, all the best.